It's time for Warhammer. Our matchup in this battle report will be between the Dwarfs and the Dark Elves. This is Game 4 of our 1,000 points tournament series, involving 6 different teams and players. In the regular season, each team will play each other once, and then there will be a double elimination playoffs. And as you can see, this is Game 4. The Dark Elves just came off of a loss to the Wood Elves, and then the Dwarfs recently beat the Daemons. Let's look at the armies, starting with the Dwarfs. And the Dwarf army that you are looking at is the Brimstone clan. They are led by a Thane. He carries 2 hand weapons and wears medium armor. He costs 67 points. Next, there's a unit of 20 dwarf warriors. They have hand weapons, shields, and light armor. They also have full command, and they are worth 210 points. Next is a unit of 15 quarrelers. They carry crossbows and wear light armor, and despite what you see, they have a champion only. They are worth 190 points. Next, there's a unit of 10 Longbeards. They carry great weapons and wear medium armor. They have a full command, and they are worth 170 points. Next is a unit of 10 Hammerers. They carry great weapons and wear medium armor. They also have full command, and they are worth 180 points. There's also a unit of 10 Slayers. They carry 2 hand weapons and have no armor. They also have full command and are worth 140 points. And finally, there's a bolt thrower unit worth 45 points. The entire army adds up to 1,002 points. And here is the breakdown. I forgot to mention that the name of the Thane is Rumar Trollbane. This is the Dark Elves host of Optimus Callus. He is an elf master. He wears medium armor, and he carries the Venom Blade, which gives him poison attacks. He is worth 70 points. He has brought with him a unit of 20 Dark Shards. They have repeater crossbows and wear medium armor. They also have a full command. They are worth 270 points. Also a unit of 20 Bleak Swords. They have swords and shields and wear medium armor. They also have a full command. They come in at 210 points. Also, there's 20 Dread Spears. They carry spears and shields and wear medium armor. They have a full command, and they cost 230 points. Then there's a unit of 8 Dark Riders. They ride on dark steeds. They have spears but no shields, and they wear light armor. They also have full command. They are worth 150 points. There's also a unit of 5 Harpies. They can fly, they have no armor, they have a champion only, and they are worth 70 points. The full army comes to a total of 1,000 points. And here's how it breaks down. And here is the battlefield on a 4x8 table. The terrain was set up using our random landscape generator that our club has developed. And the landscape that we rolled up was hills. And this battlefield contains 4 hills. The 2 nearest hills are normal hills, and the 2 farthest hills are mysterious. There is also a mysterious forest up in the corner. And then the lower left corner has a mage stone, which only affects wizards, which there are none in this game. And then in the upper left corner, there is a dwarf sentinel stone. And that stone grants +1 combat resolution to a unit within 10 inches and with unit strength 10 or less. There's also some scatter terrain which will work like obstacles. There's 2 trees, some shrubs, a cave, and some giant ribs. Here's another look at the mysterious forest and hills. Let's look at deployment. And the dwarfs took the side with the sentinel stone and the mysterious forest. On the right flank are the Longbeards and then the Slayers. In the center is the bolt thrower and the warriors. Continuing on to the left flank is the unit of hammerers, with the Thane leading the unit. And then the far left flank, the quarrelers. There's a little gap between them and the mysterious forest. The Dark Elves deployed on the side with the Mage Stone. They have the Dark Shards on their left flank, followed by the Dark Riders. The center holds the Dread Spears and then the Bleak Swords. The Harpies are on the far right flank. And then the Elf Master is standing boldly alone on the hill. And before we start the game, there's 2 items. The Dark Elves have 1 Vanguard unit, the Dark Riders. They will advance forward, but not at double speed. And then we also have a club rule that will affect the dwarfs. If a mysterious terrain item is found within the deployment zone of an army, they are allowed to discover the mystery before the start of the game, but after deployment. So they rolled on our big list of mysterious forests and rolled up an enchanted forest, which is number 15 on our big 4d6 list of mysterious forests. You can have a look at our list of mysterious forests at our hobby blog, which is bonepileminiatures.com. Look under our Rules Supplement tab. There will also be a link in the video description. The magical effects of that forest are that the first unit to enter into the forest gains the Unbreakable rule. So that finishes the game setup, and we will move on to the first round of the battle. And the Dark Elves will get the first turn, starting with the movement phase. Each unit is out of range for charging and shooting, so they all decided to march forward. The Dark Riders are skirting up the left flank, avoiding one of the hills. The Dark Shards are moving up behind them. In the center, the Dread Spears and the Bleak Swords split around the row of shrubs. So shrubs and brush are not normal terrain items found in the original Warhammer terrain list. They are an option that our club has added, and all they do is cause a -1 movement penalty to a unit moving through them, and they don't prevent marching. They also don't block line of sight, but they do have minor shooting effects on units that have ballistic skill of 3 or less. And I will explain what those effects are if the situation comes up. But for now, these 2 units, avoid them altogether. The Elf Master also marched forward down off the hill. And then the Harpies in the corner did not take off into the air this turn. They moved forward a few inches on the ground. So our club has our own special rules on flying models that we have put together. I will try to explain as we go. There will also be a link in the video description below. I have put out a video on our flying rules on this channel, which will be linked below, so you can check that out if you are interested. But this will wrap up all the movement on this Dark Elf's turn. They have no magic in this game, and they are also out of range for shooting, and there's no close combats yet. So this will end their turn. We'll move on to the dwarf's turn. The dwarf units are all out of range for charging. Remaining moves. All 3 units in the center march forward, but the dwarfs can only march 6 inches. And during the march, the Quarrelers venture a little bit into the forest, which is the Enchanted Forest, and in doing so they gain the bonus of the Unbreakable rule for the rest of the game, and they also pass their dangerous terrain check. On the right flank, the Longbeards also march forward, the Bolt Thrower inches forward, and then the Slayers, they do a swift reform so they can get around the Dwarf Sentinel Stone. That will end the Dwarf's movement phase, and that is all that they can do for this turn. Dark Elves turn 2. All units are out of range for charging, so they all marched forward. The Dark Shards and the Dread Spears are approaching a hill. The Elf Master and the Bleak Swords are approaching the Colossal Ribs. And then the Dark Riders are already halfway across the battlefield on the left flank. And then on the right flank, the Harpies are still inching forward on the ground, coming up behind that cave. And that will finish the Dark Elves' movement, and that will also finish their turn. Back over to the Dwarfs. Dwarfs' movement phase, and they have no charges to declare. Remaining moves. The Quarrelers and the Warriors both marched forward, and then the Hammerers only inched forward. Over on the right flank, the Bolt Thrower did not move. The Longbeards inched forward, and the Slayers failed a swift reform, but were able to reform forward. And that will end the movement phase. On to the shooting phase. The Bolt Thrower will fire at its first target, which will be the Dark Riders directly in front of them. But on their first shot, the Bolt Thrower ends up rolling a misfire. So there is no hit on the Dark Riders, and then the Dwarfs must roll on the War Machine misfire chart. And our club has put together our own misfire chart, which is now on the screen. And this chart applies to all types of war machines, including Bolt Throwers. And so the Dwarfs roll on the chart, and they score a 1. The machine is destroyed on its first shot. The War Machine crew will be removed, but the machine itself will remain on the battlefield as an obstacle. The Dark Elves will score points for that loss, and that will end the shooting phase of the Dwarfs, and it will also end their turn. Dark Elves turn 3, movement phase. No charges were declared. Remaining moves. The Dark Riders began to arc into the center of the field, moving at full speed. And the Dark Shards and the Dread Spears marched around both flanks of the hill. Over on the right flank, the Harpies continued walking up towards the cave on the ground. They came in base contact with the cave and seemed to be using it for cover. Now in this game, the cave is not a mysterious cave, it's just a normal one, so there's no random beast hiding inside the cave, as I've mentioned in other games. Otherwise, those Harpies might be dealing with a serious problem right about now. But luckily for them, it is unoccupied. And at the center right, the Elf Master decides to march through the giant ribs, and then the Bleak Swords decide to follow suit. They are also going to march through the ribs, but they had to reform this turn before they could do that. I think they failed a swift reform. And why did they go through the ribs? The ribs don't really do anything for the units. I guess the simple answer is because they're there. So that completes all the Dark Elves' movements. They cannot shoot this turn, and there's no close combat. So that will end their turn. We'll go back to the dwarfs. Turn 3. No charges from the dwarfs. Remaining moves. Over on their right flank, the Longbeards and the Slayers both marched forward. And back in the center, the Warriors inched forward their normal move value, and then the Quarrelers and the Hammerers, they did not move. That ends their movement on to the shooting phase. And the Quarrelers will also shoot at the Dark Riders. They will fire off 11 shots, and they have no shooting penalties with this volley, and they end up hitting with 6 of their shots. And then they roll for wounds and score 4 wounds. The Dark Riders try rolling for their armor save, and they score 1 save. That will allow 3 wounds to go through on the unit. And whereas their unit size was 8, that will cause panic for heavy casualties and will force a panic test. So the Dark Riders roll their panic test and they pass. They will not run from the crossbows. But the first 3 Dark Elves are fallen, and that will end the shooting phase of the Dwarfs and their turn. We'll go back to the Dark Elves. And the Dark Elves begin the round with declaring a charge. The Dark Riders into the Quarrelers. But the Riders have been reduced to 5 Riders, and the Quarrelers are still at full strength of 15 Dwarfs. And the Quarrelers have gained the Unbreakable rule from the Enchanted Forest. So they decide to stand and shoot in reaction to the charge. And then the Dark Riders will use the Swift Stride rule for their charge distance roll. So they roll for their charge and they pass it. No problem there. But now they must face the barrage of crossbow bolts coming at them. The Quarrelers will get off 11 more shots, but they will have a shooting penalty for the stand and shoot reaction. So they end up only scoring 2 hits on the Dark Riders. But then both hits go through as wounds. The Dark Riders will get a chance to use their armor save, and they score 1. So 1 Dark Rider is killed during the charge. So only 4 of them will get to attack the Dwarfs. Those results will be determined during the combat phase, which will be the first combat of the game. But first we must finish the movement phase. Moving on to remaining moves. So with the Quarrelers occupied by the Dark Riders, all the elves continue marching up the battlefield. The bleak swords are making their way through the giant ribs. The elf master is still leading the pack. The dread spears and the dark shards are still making their way up the left flank. And over on the right flank, the harpies are still on the ground, hiding behind the cave, but they did do a reform move. And that will end the movement phase. And the Dark Elves will have no shooting phase again, since the Dark Shards marched this turn. So next up is the combat phase. The Dark Riders and the Quarrelers. And in our club, the elves of any race do not have always strikes first, but the Dark Riders will still have the initiative against the Dwarfs, especially since they charged. So the Dark Riders will get 5 attacks on the Quarrelers, using their spears. They roll for hits and they score 2 hits. And then rolling for wounds, they score 1 wound on the Quarrelers. The Quarrelers have an armor save and they roll and score it. No final wounds go through on the Quarrelers. But next to attack will be the Dark Steeds. They will get 1 attack each. They roll for blows and only score 1 hit of the 4. And then rolling for wounds, they score nothing. A big goose egg from the steeds. But I did fail to mention that before any of these attacks, there would have been impact hits to resolve. Those would have been issued from the cavalry onto the quarrelers. However, no wounds were generated from those impact hits. And so, with 3 chances to wound the quarrelers, the Dark Steeds come up with nothing. So now the quarrelers can strike back. And they will get to make 11 attacks with their hand weapons. They roll and end up scoring 6 hits upon the Dark Riders. And then rolling for wounds, they score 4 of them. The Dark Riders have an armor save, and they end up scoring 2 armor saves. So the quarrelers end up with 2 final wounds on the Dark Riders. Now looking at combat resolution. So we'll add those 2 wounds of the quarrelers with the bonus points for all their ranks. But remember that the quarrelers do not have a banner. They did not pay the cost for a banner, just the champion. And that goes against the 2 points from the Dark Riders for charging and for having a banner. So the quarrelers easily win this combat, and the Dark Riders are forced to take a break test. But before they take a break test, the Dark Riders will lose 1 leadership value, and the quarrelers will gain 1 leadership value. This is due to a special rule that our club has put together based upon the results of close combat. There will be a penalty or a bonus connected with the results of the combat, and those leadership bonuses and penalties are cumulative to plus or minus 3 from the original unit's leadership value. So the Dark Riders are down 1 leadership, and the quarrelers are up 1. Those bonuses and penalties will follow them throughout the game and will be used for all their leadership tests, including this break test. So the Dark Riders roll and they end up failing their break test, and they must run. They will run from the quarrelers using their swift stride rule, and they make it 9 inches away from the quarrelers. The quarrelers will choose to pursue them, and they score 9 inches as well. They catch the Dark Riders. That was a big roll for them, and they have enough unit strength to cut down the rest of the riders. Just like Gimli said, the dwarfs are deadly at close range and on the sprint. The Dark Riders found out the hard way, and they are no more. The dwarfs will take the points for that unit, and that will end the combat phase. And that will end the Dark Elves' turn. Dwarfs' movement phase. They have no charges to declare. Remaining moves. The warriors and the hammerers in the center both march forward. And then the quarrelers do not move. And then on the right flank, the slayers march forward, but the longbeards do not. They move their normal distance. Shooting phase. The quarrelers aim for another target, and that will be the dark shards on their right. The quarrelers will have to deal with a long-range penalty, but they get off 11 shots and end up rolling 5 hits. And then of those 5 hits, 4 of them go through as wounds. And then the Dark Shards roll for their armor save, and they end up with 2. So 2 final wounds go through on the Dark Shards from the quarrelers. And that's not enough for a panic test. That will end the shooting phase of the dwarfs and their turn. Turn 5. The Dark Elves have no charges to declare. Remaining moves. The Bleak Swords finished moving through the giant ribs, and then the Elf Master decided to back up and joined the unit of the Bleak Swords, and they did pass a swift reform. The Dread Spears continued marching up the center, and then the Dark Shards on the left moved forward their normal distance. And then in the right rear corner, the Harpies are still hiding on the ground behind the cave. Shooting phase. The Dark Shards target the Quarrelers. The Dark Shards have repeater crossbows, which gives them 2 shots per attack, and they also have armor piercing 1. So they fire off 22 shots, and these shots will be subject to a penalty for long range. And they end up with 7 hits on the Quarrelers. And then rolling for wounds, they score 2 wounds. The Quarrelers only have light armor and no shields, so the armor-piercing shots nullify that armor and they scored 2 final wounds. So 2 dwarfs fall, but there is no need for a panic test. And since there's no combat, that will end the Dark Elves' turn. And the dwarfs have no charges to declare. Remaining moves. The center group of warriors and hammerers marched towards the Dark Shards. On the left flank, the Quarrelers did not move. And then over on the right flank, the Longbeards and the Slayers moved forward their normal distance. Shooting phase. The Quarrelers decide to retaliate against the Dark Shards, and they fire back. And the dwarfs fire off 11 bolts from their crossbows. They do not get double shots like the elves do. And the Dark Shards are also at long range for the Quarrelers. And they manage to hit with 4 of their bolts. And then rolling for wounds, they score 3 wounds. And the Dark Shards roll for their armor save, which is reduced by 1 due to the strength of the dwarfs' crossbows. And they manage to score 1 armor save. So 2 final wounds go through on the Dark Shards. And that will end the dwarfs' shooting phase and their turn. Turn 6. The Dark Elves still have no charges to declare. Remaining moves. The Bleak Swords do another swift reform. This was to change up the ranks and columns. And they also moved forward a few more inches. And then the Dread Spears moved forward and climbed the hill, the mysterious hill. Our club has a 4d6 list of mysterious hills that we have put together. And they rolled up number 18, which is a sunny hill. And this hill affects shooting units, in that it allows the entire unit to shoot instead of just the 2 front ranks. But the Dread Spears are not a shooting unit, so they will not be affected by it. But another shooting unit in the game could get up on that hill and take advantage of the special rule. So that will take care of all the remaining moves for the Dark Elves. The Dark Shards did not move. Next up is the shooting phase. The Dark Shards continue their shootout with the Quarrelers. This will be another long-range target for them. So the Dark Shards fire off 22 bolts at the Quarrelers. And they are hit with 14 of the bolts. And then rolling for wounds, they score 7 wounds on the Quarrelers. And once again, the armor-piercing bolts nullify the light armor of the Quarrelers. So 7 more dwarfs will fall. But since the Quarrelers have gained the unbreakable rule, they do not have to take a panic test due to heavy casualties. So they will remain where they are. And that will also end the shooting phase of the Dark Elves and their turn. And the dwarfs have no charges to declare. Remaining moves. The Hammerers reform their unit, facing the hill with the Dread Spears on it. The warriors march at full speed towards the Dark Shards. And then on the right flank, the Slayers and the Longbeards do the same, marching forward. And then the Quarrelers on the left flank do not move. And then for the shooting phase, the Quarrelers pick a new target. This time they will attack the Dread Spears on the Sunny Hill. But now the Quarrelers unit is down to only 6 dwarfs, so they will get off 7 shots at the Dread Spears. And they manage to score 5 hits on those Dread Spears. And then rolling for wounds, they come up with 4 wounds. The Dread Spears have a 4+ armor save, which will be reduced by 1 due to the crossbows. But they score 0 saves. So 4 Dark Elves will fall to the Quarrelers. But that is not enough for a panic test. That will be the end of the shooting phase for the Dwarfs, and will also be the end of their turn. The Dark Elves open with declaring a charge, and that will be the Dread Spears charging into the Quarrelers. The Dread Spears don't want to be shot up by those crossbows. So the Dread Spears roll, and they do make the charge. However, the Quarrelers elected to stand and shoot, and in doing so they end up dropping 2 of the Dread Spears from the unit, which will cut them down to 14 Dread Spears. Remaining moves. The Bleak Swords march towards the Sunny Hill, and then the Dark Shards do not move. And then finally down in the corner, the Harpies take off from behind the cave and move their normal distance forward, which is towards the center of the field. Shooting phase. The Dark Shards pick a new target now that they are done with their shoot-off with the Quarrelers. Now they target the Dwarf Warriors who are bearing down on them. They fire another 22 bolts at the Dwarf Warriors with their repeating crossbows. And they manage to hit with 15 of the bolts. 15 hits. And then rolling for wounds, they score 6 wounds. The Dwarf Warriors have light armor and shields for a normal 5+ armor save, but those bolts do have armor piercing. The Warriors end up scoring 0 armor saves. So 6 of them fall, cutting their unit down to 14 warriors. And due to the heavy casualties rule, they will have to take a panic test. The Warriors roll for panic and they end up passing the test. They will not run from the Dark Shards. On to the combat phase. The Dread Spears against the Quarrelers. The Dread Spears have 14 elves, and the Quarrelers have 6 dwarfs. The Dread Spears will get to attack in the 3rd rank, and they also have higher initiative, so they will strike first. The Dread Spears have 15 attacks, and they end up scoring 9 hits on the Quarrelers. And then rolling for wounds, they score 5 wounds. The Quarrelers have light armor and try their armor save and end up scoring 0 armor saves. So 5 dwarfs will fall to the elves. That leaves only the unit champion remaining. He has 2 attacks and will strike back. He is able to score 1 hit on the Dread Spears. And then that 1 hit does go through as a wound. And then the Dread Spears fail their armor save and their parry save. So 1 elf will fall. Combat resolution. Obviously the dwarfs could not withstand the charge of the Dread Spears, and the Dark Elves will win this combat. The elves will win 8-1. However, the Quarrelers still have the unbreakable rule, and they will not have to take a break test. So the remaining Quarreler, the champion, will continue to fight the Dread Spears for another round. The champion will fight till the last man, but the champion will lose his leadership bonus and the Dread Spears will gain one. But that will end the combat phase for the Dark Elves and their turn. The Dwarfs open the round by declaring a charge. The Hammerers into the Dread Spears. The Dread Spears will be forced to hold and take the charge into their flank. And this will be a long charge for the Dwarfs. The charge distances in our club are a little shorter than you are used to. What we do is we take 2d6 and only use the highest die roll, and then add that to the regular M value. And the charge distance for the Hammerers in this case ended up being an 8-inch charge, so they will need at least a 5 in order to make the charge. So they roll for the charge and they pass it. They get the 5+. So the Dread Spears will be in a two-way fight. No more charges declared from the Dwarfs, so we'll go on to remaining moves. On the right flank, the Warriors and the Longbeards marched forward towards the Dark Shards, and then the Slayers pivoted towards the center of the battlefield. That's it for movement. The Dwarfs cannot shoot this turn, so we'll move on to the combat phase. First to strike in this combat will be the Dread Spears. They will have to divide their attacks between both flanks. Starting off with the front flank, they will throw 6 attacks into the last quarreler. They roll for hits and they score 3. And then rolling for wounds, they score 0 wounds. This last quarreler is too tough. However, one of the wound roll results was a 1, and due to the murderous prowess rule, the Dread Spears get to re-roll that 1 die. And the re-roll does come up with the wound in this case, and the quarreler cannot save it. The last quarreler falls. The unit is destroyed. But the Dread Spears still have more attacks to deal out. They will throw 4 into the Hammerers on their left flank. And in this case, they score 2 hits on the Hammerers. And then rolling for wounds, they score 0 wounds again. But this time, murderous prowess does not come into play. Next to attack will be the Thane that is part of the Hammerers unit. Since he has 2 axes, he will have 4 attacks on the Dread Spears. He rolls for hits and scores 2 hits. And then rolling for wounds, he scores 1 wound on the Dread Spears. They will try their armor save, and they score the armor save. No wounds from the Thane. Next to attack will be the Hammerers. And the 4 Dwarfs on the front rank will each have double attacks, for a total of 13 from the unit. And they end up rolling 6 hits on the Dread Spears. And then rolling for wounds, they score 5 wounds. The Dread Spears will try their armor save, and they score 1 of those, and then 0 parry saves. So 4 Dark Elves will end up falling from the Hammerers. So despite the demise of the Quarrelers, the Dwarfs decisively win this round of combat. So the leadership values of each unit are adjusted accordingly. And then the Dread Spears roll for their break test, and they pass. This combat will go on for another round, but that will be the only combat of this round, and that will end the Dwarf's turn. We'll go back to the Dark Elves. The Dark Elves do not declare any charges this turn. Remaining moves. The Dark Shards decide to hold their position, and then the Bleak Swords marched forward towards the warriors, passing their leadership test. The Harpies continued to soar towards the battlefront, and then the Dread Spears pulled off a combat reform in order to face the Hammerers. Shooting phase. The Dark Shards target the Dwarf Warriors once again, but this time at close range. They will fire off another 22 shots with their repeater crossbows, and this time they roll up 16 hits. And then rolling for wounds, they score 4 wounds. The warriors attempt their armor save and they score 0 saves. So 4 of the warriors will fall. And that will be just enough wounds to spark a panic test on the warriors. So they roll for their leadership test and they pass. They will stay in the fight. But this will end the shooting phase. We'll move on to the combat. Back to the Dread Spears and the Hammerers. And the Dread Spears are down to 9 elves. But they will get to strike first. They will roll dice for 10 attacks. And they will ignore the Thane and put them all into the Hammerers. And they score 4 hits on the Hammerers. And then rolling for wounds, they score 3 wounds. And then the Hammerers try their armor save, and they score 2 armor saves. So 1 Hammerer will fall. But next to strike will be the Thane. But he ends up missing all of his attacks. So we'll move on to the Hammerers' attacks. But the Hammerers don't do much better. They only score 4 hits. And then rolling for wounds, they score 2 wounds. And then the Dread Spears are able to save 1 wound. So 1 Dread Spear will fall. Combat resolution. And the Hammerers will just edge out the Dread Spears and win this combat. Leadership is adjusted for both units, and then the Dread Spears have to take a break test. They roll and they pass. This combat will continue for another round, and that will end the combat phase for the Dark Elves. We'll move on to the Dwarfs' turn. The Dwarfs start their turn by declaring a charge. This will be the warriors into the Dark Shards, and the Dark Shards will elect to stand and shoot. And the warriors roll for their charge test, and they pass it. And the Dark Shards stand and shoot reaction takes down 2 of the warriors on their way in on the charge. Remaining moves. The Longbeards march towards the flank of the Dark Shards, and then the Slayers inch forward towards the Bleak Swords. Combat phase. Starting with the new combat, the warriors and the Dark Shards. Even though the warriors charged, the Dark Shards have higher initiative and will strike first. They will have 11 attacks on the warriors. They roll for hits and they connect with 5 hits. And then rolling for wounds, they score 2 wounds. But then they manage to score 1 extra wound due to the murderous prowess rule. They scored 1 on the reroll. That makes a total of 3 wounds. And then the warriors get to roll for their armor save and they score 1 save. So 2 dwarf warriors will fall by the Dark Shards. But now the dwarfs will strike back. The warriors will get to make 7 attacks back. They roll for hits and they score 2. And then rolling for wounds, they score 1 wound. The Dark Shards try to save those wounds and come up with nothing. So 1 Dark Shard will fall. Combat resolution. The Dark Elves will pull off the win for this combat. The warriors will lose a leadership value, and the Dark Shards will gain 1. and then the warriors must take a break test. So the warriors roll, and they fail. They have had enough of these dark shards. However, as they turn to run, the Longbeards are within range, and they give the unit a re-roll for their break test. So they give the break test another try, and this time they pass it. The veterans give them a change of heart. This combat will continue to the next round. Next combat, the Hammerers and the Dreadspears. The Dreadspears are down to 8 elves, and then the Hammerers still have 9 plus the Thane. But the Dreadspears will strike first. They throw 9 attacks at the Hammerers, and they score 3 hits. And then rolling for wounds, they score 1 wound. The Hammerers attempt to save the wound, and they fail it. So 1 wound will go through on the Hammerers unit. But now the Dwarfs will strike back, starting with the Thane with his 4 attacks. He rolls and scores 2 hits. And then for wounds, he scores 2 wounds. The Dreadspears roll for their saves, and they score 1 save. Next to strike will be the Hammerers, with their double attacks on the front row. They will get a total of 13 attacks, with +1 strength due to their great weapons. They end up scoring 6 hits. And then rolling for wounds, they score 4 wounds. The Dreadspears try to save those wounds, and they will save 2. So 2 more wounds for a total of 3 will go through on the Dreadspears. Combat resolution, and the Hammerers pull off another victory this round. They will gain another leadership, and the Dreadspears will lose another. And then the Dreadspears will have to take another break test. And so they roll for their break test, and they fail. The last 5 Dreadspears will run from the Hammerers, but they will lose their standard bearer, and then roll for their flee distance. And in this case, they roll a double 1, only 2 inches away from the Hammerers. And the Dwarfs decide to pursue, and they catch them. They will run down the Dreadspears and cut them all down. The Dwarfs will get a free reform, and they will score the full points for the Dreadspears unit and their unit standard. That will be the end of the Dwarfs combat round and their turn. We'll go back to the Dark Elves. Dark Elves movement phase. The Bleak Swords inch forward, and then the Harpies continue to fly towards the action. Combat phase. And we'll continue with the Dark Shards and the Dwarf Warriors. The Dark Shards will get to strike first, and they still have 11 attacks. First they roll to hit, and they score 4 hits. And then the wound roll comes up with 3 wounds. The Warriors try their armor save, and they score 1 armor save. So 2 Dwarf Warriors will fall this round. That leaves only 2 Warriors remaining, which gives them 3 attacks in return. So their 3 attacks generate 1 hit. And then that 1 hit comes up with 1 wound. And then the Dark Shards have their armor save, and they fail. So 1 wound will go through on the Dark Elves. Combat resolution. The Dark Shards will win combat once again, and the leadership values are adjusted accordingly. And then the Warriors must take their break test. They roll, and they pass this one as well. They will stick around for another round, but there's only 2 of them left. That will end this combat round, and the Dark Elves' turn. Back to the Dwarfs. The Dwarfs open the round by declaring a charge. The Longbeards into the Dark Shards on their flank. But they ended up failing the charge and only moved 3 inches forward. And that was their only movement of the round. The combat phase also ended up being a dud. No wounds were afflicted on either side. But the Dwarfs lost combat resolution, but they passed their break test. Now we'll go back to the Dark Elves' turn. The Dark Elves open this round by declaring a charge. The Bleak Swords into the Hammerers. But they end up with another failed charge, and they only move forward 2 inches. And the Harpies are still making their way towards the action. They're almost there. And that will end their movement phase. Back to combat. And in this round we'll just skip to the results. Both units inflicted a wound on each other, but one warrior still remains, those pesky little dwarfs. But the Dark Shards win combat resolution again, but the leadership values are not adjusted. Both units are already at their maximum accumulation of bonuses and penalties, which is plus or minus 3, and the final dwarf warrior ends up passing his break test. So he will stick around for another round, and that will end the combat phase, and we'll move back over to the dwarfs. However, the Dark Elves will score 25 points. That's for capturing the unit standard of the dwarf warriors. The dwarfs opened this round by declaring 2 charges, and they were successful with both. The Hammerers charged into the Bleak Swords, and then the Longbeards made it into the flank of the Dark Shards. For remaining moves, the Slayers continued marching forward. Back to the combat phase, starting with the Dark Shards against the Longbeards and the last dwarf warrior. And despite the Longbeards charging, the Dark Shards have higher initiative and will strike first. And the unit champion of the Dark Shards will make way over to the flank to be in contact with the Longbeards. But first they will throw their attacks into the last dwarf warrior, and that will be 6 attacks. They end up getting 3 hits, and then for wounds they score 1 wound. The warrior champion tries his armor save, and he fails. The last warrior falls. And next the Dark Shards throw 4 attacks on the flank against the Longbeards. They end up scoring 2 hits on the Longbeards, and then they generate 0 wounds. But that is all the Dark Elves' attacks. So now the Longbeards can strike back. They have enough base contact to make 11 attacks. And they end up rolling 5 hits. And then with their great weapons, 4 of those 5 hits end up as wounds. The Dark Shards try to save those wounds, and they end up scoring 2 saves. So 2 final wounds go through on those Dark Shards. Combat resolution. And the dwarfs come up with the win in this combat. Leadership values are adjusted accordingly. And then the Dark Shards must take a break test. So they roll for their test, and they pass it. They will be locked into combat in another round with the Longbeards. But the Dark Elves will gain the points for finishing off the Dwarf Warriors unit. Next combat, we'll move over to the Hammerers and the Bleak Swords. Now remember that the Hammerers unit has the Dwarf Thane, and then the Bleak Swords unit has the Dark Elf Master, and he has the Venom Blade with poison attacks. And even though there is no challenge issued in this combat between those two, they do make way to be in base contact with each other for this combat. First to strike will be the Elf Master. He will throw his 3 attacks directly into the Thane. And the Elf Master scores 2 hits on the Thane. And then rolling for wounds, he scores 1. But due to a reroll for the Murderous Prowess rule, he's able to score 1 more wound on the Thane, which makes 2 wounds. The Thane will try his armor save, and he scores 1 save, allowing 1 wound to go through. So the Thane is wounded from this exchange. Next to strike will be the Bleak Swords, and they will throw all their attacks into the Hammerers. So they throw 10 attacks at the Dwarfs, and end up hitting with 4. And then rolling for wounds, they come up with 0. But then thanks to the Murderous Prowess rule, they are able to save 1 of those and turn it into a wound. They spare themselves of the embarrassment. So the Hammerers have 1 wound to save, and they fail. 1 Hammerer will fall. Next to strike will be the Thane into the Elf Master. He has 4 attacks due to his 2 hand axes. He ends up scoring 1 hit. And then that 1 hit goes through as a wound. The Elf Master tries to save with his armor save, and he gets it. He prevents the wound. Fate has favored the Master over the Thane. And finally, last to attack will be the Hammerers. They will have 12 attacks into the Bleak Swords. They end up scoring 9 hits, but then strangely only come up with 4 wounds with their great weapons. The Bleak Swords try to save those wounds and fail with their armor save, but they do get 1 parry save. So 3 Dark Elves will fall due to the Hammerers. Combat resolution. This round turns out to be a draw. 5 points on each side. There will be no leadership adjustments and no break test. They will be locked into combat for another round. And this will also finish the Dwarf's turn. Back to the Dark Elves. Dark Elves, turn 11. We are down to the last 2 rounds of the game, and the Dark Elves are 1 point behind the Dwarf's score. This is going down to the wire. For their movement phase, the Dark Elves don't declare any charges. For remaining moves, the Harpies continue to soar towards the fight, moving towards the Longbeards and the Dark Shards. And then the Dark Shards are also able to perform a combat reform against the Longbeards. Combat phase. Back to the Dark Shards and the Longbeards. There's now only 11 Dark Shards against the 10 Longbeards. The Dark Shards throw 11 attacks at the Longbeards, and they end up hitting with 4. And then rolling for wounds, they score 0 wounds, the big goose egg. And now the Longbeards can strike back. They also have 11 attacks, and they end up scoring 9 hits on the Dark Shards. And then for wounds, they come up with 6 wounds. The Dark Shards try their armor save, and they actually score 2. And then they also score a parry save, with a total of 3 saves, allowing 3 wounds to go through. Combat resolution. The Longbeards easily win this round of combat. They will gain a leadership bonus, and the Dark Shards will lose 1. And the Dark Shards have to take a break test with their reduced leadership. So they roll, and they pass the test. They will stick around for another round of combat. Next to fight will be the Bleak Swords and the Hammerers. And the Elf Master will strike first again. 3 attacks into the Thane. He wounded the Thane last round. We'll see if he can finish him off. So he rolls for his 3 attacks and he scores 0 hits. And there's no help from the Murderous Prowess rule this time. The Thane denied all his strikes. The Bleak Swords strike next. 10 attacks into the Hammerers. And they score 4 hits. And then rolling for wounds, they get 2. And then the Hammerers try their armor save, and they score 1. So 1 Hammerer will fall to the Bleak Swords. And now the Thane will get to strike with his 4 attacks, all into the Elf Master. He rolls for his hits, and he scores all 4. 4 hits on the Master. And then he rolls for wounds and comes up with only 1. And then the Elf Master tries his armor save, and he scores it and prevents the wound. That's 2 turns in a row he's done that. Fate has been on his side. But next to attack will be the Hammerers. They will have 11 into the Bleak Swords. And their hit roll generates 7 hits. And then rolling for wounds, they score 5 wounds on the Bleak Swords. They will try their armor save, and they score 4 saves, leaving only 1 to go through. They missed the parry save on that last one. So 1 Bleak Sword will fall to the Hammerers. Combat resolution. With only a wound apiece, the Dark Elves will win the combat, thanks to their armor saves. The Bleak Swords will gain a leadership, and the Hammerers will lose one. But the Hammerers do not need to take a break test. As long as the general is in their unit, they have immunity to psychology. And that will be the end of the combat phase, and the end of the Dark Elves' turn. Dwarfs turn 11. The Slayers continue to march forward, but they are still not in combat. They have been a non-factor thus far. That's the end of the movement phase. Back to combat, starting with the Longbeards and the Dark Shards. And in this round, the combat changes momentum from the Longbeards to the Dark Shards. The Dark Shards struck first again with 9 attacks. They make up for their goose egg on the last round and score 5 hits and then 3 wounds. And then the Longbeards cannot score any armor saves, leaving 3 Longbeards to fall as casualties. And that leaves the Longbeards with only 8 attacks for their counterattack. They end up scoring 5 hits and then 3 wounds. But then the Dark Shards scored 2 armor saves. So only 1 Dark Shard falls to the Longbeards. Combat resolution. After dishing out more wounds, the Dark Shards will win the combat. Leadership is adjusted for both sides, and then the Longbeards end up passing their break test. Back to the Hammerers and the Bleak Swords. And once again, the Elf Master strikes first, with all 3 attacks into the Thane. This time all 3 attacks went through as hits, and all 3 went through as wounds. And then the Dwarf Thane desperately tries to throw 3 attempts of armor saves at those wounds, and comes up with nothing. He only had 1 wound left to give. His cup of mortality is full. He will go the way of the great feast tables under the mountain. The Elf Master prevails. And the Bleak Swords strike next. They end up scoring 6 hits from their 10 attacks. They score 2 wounds initially, but then get 1 more off of a reroll due to the Murderous Prowess rule. Then the Hammerers try to save those 3 wounds, and they score 1 armor save. 2 Hammerers will fall. Now the dwindling dwarfs only have 9 attacks back, but they only score 2 hits. But both hits go through as wounds. The bleak swords try their armor saves, and this time they score the goose egg, leaving 2 bleak swords to fall. Combat resolution. This time the bleak swords will win by a bunch. The momentum switching in this combat as well. Leadership is adjusted on both sides, and now with the general dead, the hammerers will have to take a break test, which they pass. And the dark elves will score the points for killing the thane and get the bonus points for killing the army general. Now they will be ahead in the score, and then the entire dwarf army must roll on the killed leader reaction chart. This is a house rule that our club has developed. It reflects the reaction of each unit in response to the death of a hero or beloved leader. So here's the chart displayed on the screen, and each unit will have to roll separately in the case of the general. But for the results, each unit ends up rolling either a 1 or a 2, which require leadership tests, but they all end up passing their leadership tests. So no effects occur upon any of these units. A fallen dwarf thane is nothing these units haven't seen before. But that will end the combat phase for the dwarfs and their turn. We'll go back to the dark elves and the final turn of the game. For their final turn, the dark elves declare a charge. The harpies into the longbeards. But remember that our club has our own special rules regarding flying units. Flying units can stay in the air and remain there, out of the reach of ground units, for as long as they choose. But if they decide to get into combat, they can do an air-to-ground maneuver called a swoop, which is a one-off attack. But then after blows are exchanged, they swoop back up into the air in an ascending U-shaped maneuver. The swoop distance for the descent is M plus D6. And then for the ascent on the other side, another M plus D6. And if the aerial unit wants to fight another round of combat, they will have to either come around for another swoop or land on the ground on one turn and then charge on the ground on the next turn. And then they can be locked into combat for multiple rounds. But a swoop maneuver must be performed on an open flank of the defending unit. So the harpies attempt the swoop maneuver on the flank of the longbeards. And their charge fails. They do not make it in. They only go forward 4 inches on the swoop. The harpies will not even make it into combat this game. That's the last charge and move that the dark elves can attempt. Back over to combat. And we will stay right here for our first combat, the dark shards and the longbeards. And there's 7 individuals on both sides of this fight. And the dark shards begin by scoring 3 hits on the longbeards and then 1 wound. And then the longbeards save that wound for 0 wounds scored. And for their counterattack, the longbeards end up scoring 6 hits, but then only 1 wound. The dark shards then save that wound for 0 wounds on their side, so neither unit inflicts a wound on the other. Combat resolution. With no wounds on either side, this is clearly going to be a draw. No leadership values will be adjusted, and no break test will be performed. They will be locked in combat for 1 more round. This fight represents the classical impasse between dwarfs and elves. Next combat, over to the bleak swords and the hammerers. Before the fighting starts, the elf master makes way for the other side of the rink, making sure he stays in contact with the enemy. So the elf master puts his 3 attacks into the hammerers, but he only ends up with 1 hit. But that 1 hit goes through as a wound, and then the hammerers fail to save it. So another dwarf will fall, and then the bleak swords will strike next, and they end up with 3 hits. And then they score only 1 wound. And then the hammerers try to save it, and they get it. They prevent that wound. And now the hammerers can swing back with their 7 attacks, and they hit with 5 of them. But then they score only 2 wounds. The wounds from the dwarfs' great weapons have been a little lackluster this game. But then the bleak swords are able to save 1 of those wounds, and no parry saves. So 1 bleak sword will fall, 1 fallen on each side. Combat resolution. With a wound apiece, the bleak swords will win this combat again. The hammerers are now back down to their original leadership value, so they must take another break test, and this time they pass again. The dwarfs will not give up, but that will end the Dark Elves' turn, which was their final turn, and will now go over to the dwarfs' final turn. The dwarfs have fallen behind on points. Let's see what they can do on their final round. They begin by declaring a charge into the Dark Shards. It's now or never, but this is still a bit of a long charge for them. So they roll and they get it. They make it into the flank of the Dark Shards. However, I do not have an image that shows the results of the successful charge. So just imagine that they are in contact on the Dark Shards flank. But now we will go on to the combat phase, starting over with the hammerers and the bleak swords. So the elf master throws his final 3 attacks into the hammerers, and he generates 1 hit, but then 0 wounds. But then the bleak swords attempt their attacks next. They generate only 2 hits, and then 0 wounds as well. Maybe a little battle fatigue is settling in on these bleak swords. Whatever's going on, the hammerers get to strike next. They throw their 7 attacks and they hit with 5. And then they wound with 3. The bleak swords try their armor save and they score 2. And no parries. So only 1 bleak sword will fall. Combat resolution. So this round ends up in a draw. So no break tests by either side. So this combat finishes with 3 hammerers against the master elf and 12 bleak swords. The dwarfs are outnumbered 4-1 in this situation, and realizing that made me pause a bit for a rules sanity check. I seem to remember a rule about being outnumbered. So I did some digging and found that there is an outnumber rule in the Warhammer Armies project, at least in the last version that I downloaded years ago. However, our club did not adopt all the rules from the Warhammer Army project. We just selected the ones we liked. And the outnumber rule is one that we did not adopt in our official club's rule set. And there's no outnumber rule in the original 8th edition rule set. Now the reason we did not adopt the outnumber rule is that it seemed redundant with the points for extra ranks. So we didn't think it was right to double dip on the same tactical concept in a combat resolution. So ultimately, after doing this little bit of research, I felt better about the results of this combat being a draw. So that will finish this combat and we will move on to the next one, which is the Longbeards and the Dark Shards plus the addition of the Slayers. And I apologize again, I only have a photo of the aftermath of this battle round. I do not have an image of the Slayers getting in there before the fight begins. But in this fight there are 7 Longbeards, 10 Slayers, and 7 Dark Shards involved in the combat. But of course first will be the Dark Shards with their higher initiative. They swing their 8 attacks into the Longbeards, and they score 2 hits. But then they come up with 0 wounds. The battle fatigue must really be settling in on the Dark Elves. And next to strike will be the Slayers, who charged in. They come up with 5 hits, and then they score 2 wounds. And then the Dark Shards fail their armor save, but they get 1 parry. So the Slayers only slay 1 Dark Shard. But now the Longbeards can strike. They throw their 8 attacks into the Dark Shards and score 6 hits. And then their wound roll comes up with 4. The Dark Shards try their armor save and they score 1. And then they score 1 more parry. So 2 final wounds go through on those Dark Shards. Combined with the Slayers, that makes 3. Combat resolution. And clearly the Dwarfs will win this combat, changing the momentum. The Dark Shards are down to 4 elves, and they lose a leadership and must take a break test. And they pass it. The elves are as stubborn as the dwarfs. That will be the end of this combat, and the dwarfs' turn, and the game. That is 12 turns completed. I'm really curious how this game would have finished out had we let it continue. I suspect it would have come down to just a few lonely survivors from the whole ordeal. Classical combat between elves and dwarfs. But out of respect for the tournament, we must end here and go to the final scoring to determine the winner. Final scoring, starting with the Dark Elves. They earned full points for eliminating the Dwarf Warriors and the Quarrelers, also the Bolt Thrower, and the Thane. They also earned the bonus points for capturing the banner of the Warriors, also the bonus points for killing the Army General. And they also earned points off of the Hammerers unit. The Hammerers finished the game with less than half of their unit's starting size, which means they are decimated. So the Dark Elves earn 50% of their starting cost added to their score. The grand total score for the Dark Elves comes to 727 points. Let's see if the Dwarfs can beat it. The Dwarfs scored full points for eliminating the Dread Spears, also the Dark Riders. They also scored the bonus points for the unit standards of the Dread Spears and the Dark Riders. They also earned points on the Dark Shards for decimating their unit below 50% of their starting unit. The total score for the Dwarfs adds up to 565. They fall short of the Dark Elves by 162 points. The Dark Elves are the winners, but it was a close game. It seemed like the Dark Elves were losing steam at the end, so who knows what would have happened with a few more rounds. Over to the league standings. These two teams were the first to play their second game, and they both stand at 1 win and 1 loss. But as far as total points, the Dwarfs are currently in first place in the league, with 1,715 points, followed by the Dark Elves, who stand at 1,352 points. So the Dwarfs will play next in Game 8 against the Tomb Kings. And the Dark Elves' next game will be Game 7 against the Daemons. But the next game for the overall league will be Game 5, the Daemons against Bretonia. Look for that coming up on this channel. Next, we would like to announce the Bonepile Miniatures MVP of the game. And that award will go to the Dark Elves Dark Shards. The Dark Shards were busy this game. They were deadly with their repeater crossbows. They fired off a grand total of 108 shards during the shooting phases, and those wounded 21 of the dwarfs. 9 of those wounds were inflicted upon the quarrelers, with whom they were involved in a shootout in the early part of the game. And then the other 12 wounds were inflicted upon the warriors. And then they had their own fair share of close combat. They tallied up 9 player rounds of close combat, and were a major challenge for the warriors. They also fought with the Longbeards, and then 1 player round with the Slayers. The only units not to engage with the Dark Shards were the Hammerers and the Bolt Thrower. And during the combat phases, they inflicted 9 more wounds, for a grand total of 30 dwarfs that they were responsible for wounding. And by the end of the game, 4 Dark Shards were still standing. That is impressive by any measure. And our honorable mention from the Dwarfs army is the Hammerers unit. They inflicted the most wounds upon the Dark Elves from their army, with a grand total of 15 wounds. And those are just from close combat. Add 5 more to count the dread spears they cut down in pursuit after the dread spears broke from combat in the 9th round. And then 8 of their 15 wounds from close combat were inflicted upon the bleak swords before the game came to a close. In total, they eliminated 20 Dark Elves. Here's some more vital stats from the Dwarfs. Charges. Shooting. And close combat. And here's some more stats from the Dark Elves. Charges. Shooting. And close combat. This concludes our battle report. Thanks for watching. You can subscribe to this channel if you would like to know when the next battle report drops. You may also check out more content on this channel and on BonepileMiniatures.com, which is our hobby blog. You can find information on our club rules, army showcases, and discussions, as well as more battle reports like this one. And feel free to leave any questions or comments. And with that, we will see you next time.